happy to welcome to the stage Cara Esten Hurtle, who is a computer necromancer working on everything from Telnet to VHS to Hypercard, which is extremely cool.
Hey there.
There we go. You're unmuted.
Hi. Cool. No, thank you so much for the intro. I've been watching all these talks and participating in the chat. It's been awesome this year, so it's been great to be here. So cool. Hi, I'm Cara. I'm going to talk a little bit about the aesthetics of nostalgia. This is probably like the least roguelike related thing that's happened for the entire 2 days of this conference. So bear with me a little bit in terms of the game aspect of it, because there's nothing about, well, there's 2 slides where I talk about games, and one of them is Caves of Cud, of course. So I worked on a few projects recently which use styles and themes from 80s and 90s computing to tell stories. And it's made me think about how we talk about nostalgia without burying ourselves and our stories in the past. So I'm going to start with talking about terms. So nostalgia comes from the term nostos, which in Greek means a return home. The sort of like history of that term is like largely been applied to the story of heroes returning home from the Trojan War. This shows one particular example of this, the Odyssey. All of them had one thing in common. All of these stories about coming back home after you've been gone for this 10-year war. Going back home sucked. It just was bad. You get back and you realize, wait, this place is actually actively hostile to me now. Just ask Odysseus. Like, this is especially true, to bring it back to the present, for queer and trans people like me. But really, it's not just that. That's kind of the nature of nostalgia in America. The past is a hostile place, and nostalgia demands a return to it. It's hegemonic, it's reactionary, it's make America great again for movies and video games and the 80s. And all that's true, but you're probably asking me, Cara, why are you doing that? Why are you presenting all these slides in Hypercard then, if that's the case, this 30-year-old piece of software? Well, so for one reason, Hypercard rules. And then beyond that, I think that there's more to nostalgia than just this sort of barely subtle reactionary politics. So to get into the projects that I've worked on, in 2021, me and my friend Lo Ferris edited a digital zine delivered over Telnet called New Session. We focused on literary content, so short stories, poems, a bit of ASCII art, that kind of thing. We published 2 issues. The first one began with an editor's note that we're starting over, or that we want to. And that's an important thing, this idea of starting over. But before we get to that, let me just talk about where we're starting over from. Telnet was an internet protocol that replicated the direct serial-to-serial connection between 2 computers. So if you've used like multi-user dungeons or BBSs, bulletin board systems, anything like this, you're familiar with this, because this is how old computers talked to each other before the internet. You dial in with your modem, you'd set up a serial link between 2 computers, the computers would talk to each other, and you'd see text, or you would see ASCII art, you would see a dungeon. And the internet version was meant to replace that direct telephone connection, so it was called Telnet. So the first issue was almost entirely composed of art from queer and trans authors. So this is an example of that. This is a piece by AC where they talk about the malleability of their body. This is another piece by JG. You can see the sort of heavy use of ASCII art as part of this. Here's another piece. This is by E. Carolino. This is 2 meditations on telephone girlhood. This is the initial page. This was a story about women in the Bell system. It's sort of excerpts from the history of that. And then this one is called Azalea Asterism. It talks about a trans woman kind of finding herself via the medium of a chat room, like a fandom chat room. So you can see that it plays with a lot of these sort of aesthetic themes, but also like it's specifically about queer and trans life. And that's a thing that a lot of the popular BBSs of that era weren't, which is the interesting thing. New Session started originally as a way to ask authors to engage with particular constraints. And I think that we're all like familiar, especially here, about constraints imposed by old software, sort of a breeding ground for creativity. Look at like Caves of Cud, for example. where you have this sort of like retro aesthetic in all of this. And you also, and you can do that with ASCII art for like all the other roguelikes. You see that a lot here, but like it's a constraint that's been applied. It breeds this degree of creativity. Another example of that is Sigil, the pack of Doom maps that Romero came out with like fairly recently. He spoke specifically about how engaging with this old engine really sort of allowed him to sort of think about the world itself that he was building rather than the sort of technical implementation of these details, which is really cool. But beyond all that sort of technical limitation, it used the aesthetics of nostalgia rather than constraints. So let's not just think about like what is it constraining us to, but like let's think about what we're trying to say with this. I think nostalgia really takes off when you ask the question, what if things were different? When we talk about what if things were different, we talk about a gap between the imagined and the historical. So what actually happened and how we sort of like want to picture it. Now, I think this is also something you have to be deeply careful about, because you can also sort of like create a new version of the past that like washes over all the sins that legitimately existed. So that can be a reactionary practice in and of itself. You can talk about Hamilton, where it's a critique that often comes out from this is that the Black and Latinx cast serve as a way of laundering the titular founding fathers' legacy of white supremacy. Ishmael Reed wrote an article about this. There's a lot of writing about like the specific effect that that kind of nostalgic practice has. You can also think about Stranger Things and how like a gay character in that show makes it easier to imagine that like, oh, it, has some degree of tolerance when in reality, there was mass death in the background from the during the AIDS pandemic. So you really do have to steer clear of this. It's not as on-face reactionary as just being like, hey, let's go back to the 80s. But it does have that kind of like pretending everything was all right, pretending everything was better. And I don't think it's right for us to sort of pretend that things, didn't, have these problems. So I really believe that the power in nostalgia is this delta, the friction that kind of arises when the aesthetic of a piece doesn't quite match the expected content of the piece. So from that subject, the other thing I wanted to talk about is earlier this year, I published a Hypercard stack of my own nudes, alongside some text describing my feelings about my trans gay body. This idea started specifically as a reaction to retro computing groups that had a strict no, not safe for work content policy. And that's really interesting as a queer person, especially as a trans person, is because trans life is often not safe for work. Trans existence is not safe for work, and trans joy, which is often so deeply centered on our bodies, is very not safe for work. There's not a really good way to talk about this that doesn't involve, the idea of our body developing into this thing that we want it to develop into. So these rules are deeply anti-queer, and people won't really fess up to that. They'll just say, oh, well, we're concerned about, the family or whatever. It's like, well, you're excluding whole segments of life. And not only that, they're also somewhat ahistorical. We can talk a lot about Caper and the Castro, one of the first ever explicitly queer games that was decidedly not safe for work. There was a not safe for work warning when you start the game, and it was a Hypercard stack. So this type of existence, this type of sort of thing has always existed as part of the community, but it gets brushed under the rug. Like, we're not going to talk about this. We won't let this be part of our discussions. And the reality of so much of this retro computing revival, this retro gaming content, is that it takes cis white male yearning for a simpler, better time and then dresses it up in a hobby. Well, guess what? I also yearn for that time, but it's so much more complex for me. I have to think about the reasons that I was engaging with like computers and technology and all of that, hiding away from the world, that kind of thing. I yearn for that, but I think it was something that was made hegemonic even in its time. It was, all the parts of it that were queer were kept away from me. It was brushed aside. And I think that those people that are sort of aware of that and having done that need to understand that they're the ones who are, actively doing that. And now, guess what? I'm going to keep making this content. I want revenge. I want to make something that's beautiful and exists in these groups and is still outwardly queer, outwardly trans. So anyway, I'm regularly now reading posts on Gopher, an early hypertext system, from a socialist lesbian raising a child with her partner. I'm seeing CGA rendered trans flags on old computers. If you're not familiar with Foon, their content is absolutely amazing. They post a ton of really cool, like, retro computing stuff, queer stuff. They're just great. There's also a trans woman who published a zine of Game Boy camera nudes. This is Cardamonier. You can see more of her work at diskettepress.com. There's tons of just incredible stuff, and I'm not the only person working in this aesthetic. This is largely like become something that queer and trans people are participating in. The aesthetics of old technology are being reclaimed by queers who have been here consistently, but whose narratives have been systemically shut out. And that's that delta. That's that sort of difference between point A and point B, is that we are seeing the world of like queer retro computing, and we're contrasting it with what people expect retro computing, this sort of glossed over version of the past. And we're saying there's something here, there's an aesthetic here. And I think that's really powerful. So I hope that this reclamation involves all of that sort of presence of queerness permeating into the spaces that are still dominated by cis white men. And I hope it makes them uncomfortable. I hope that they understand that this is something that they can take from us once, maybe in our childhoods, but they can't do it again. And that it's not their story, but it's our story too. So thank you really very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed being able to present to you all here at Roguelike Celebration. If you want, you can check out a new session at anewsession.com. I talked about it being on Telnet, but there's also an HTML version that I published there. Makes it a little bit easier if you don't want to fire up a Telnet client. There's also Body Out of Time, and again, this is very not safe for work, but if you're interested in that, that's at caraesten.itch.io. It comes with a Mac emulator so that you can get running really quickly. And you can find me on Twitter at Cara Esten. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. And I will say, I think I saw someone describe the vibe of this talk as joyful rage, which I love. And yeah, it's really fantastic given that this conference spends a lot of time talking about, older technology, older history of this particular genre. And, we have an idea of within this genre and the space of games, kind of how history can be lost and how it can be kind of niche. But then, this whole element to it as well is something that I'm really thankful that, you took the time to be able to let us highlight that part of the history as well. On, the conference stage.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed talking about this, and the joyful rage thing is 100% my vibe. So thanks.
Yeah, and it looks like we have a little bit of time for questions, which so far no questions quite yet, because you went really fast. It was great. It was just like very energy. In lieu of questions, I guess just if there are any other maybe places offhand to drop of like other ways to learn about some more of this history? Yeah,
I think in general, the places to check out that I find really interesting are SDF's Gopher arc, or what they call it, vlogs. I've been like really fascinated with lately. There's a variety of different people writing about a variety of different things, which is really cool. There's also like a ton of like really interesting retro computing content done by Action Retro. They run a couple sites called FrogFind, which is a search engine for vintage computers, 68K News, which is basically the news feeds formatted down so that you can read them on old browsers. And there's a ton of other stuff where like retro computing content is indexed through those things. Yeah, I'm trying to think of like other good places to start, but that would be a good place to try.
Yeah. That is great. And actually, like, bam, right away, there's 4 questions, which now there's more questions than we'll have time for.
Cool.
The top one. When did you make your first stack, and do you remember what it was?
My first stack was playing around with Hypercard because I was in class, and there was something on there that I was just sort of like, I don't know what this is. I'm going to start clicking around with this. I'm bored. I finished all my homework. So I started clicking around with Hypercard. I think I just made I was like, oh, cool. You can put buttons in this and make the buttons do stuff. This is awesome. Most of the time, though, when I was young, I was playing around with QBasic. It was kind of my thing back then.
Nice. Excellent. Yes. I think I've messed around. I think also my dad and I have talked about QBasic, which is great. One other quick question, which is up to the top. What retro aesthetics really speak to you?
I think a lot of the retro aesthetics that speak to me are the ones that sort of understand that, the ones that aren't doing it just to do it. the cohesiveness of like an art project needs to sort of understand that like you're not just doing retro content because it's interesting that like old computers exist. Like it's the thing that matters to me is like when you use old technology to tell a story that couldn't be told in any other way. And I think that that's been like the really interesting. I mentioned Carta's Game Boy camera photos and stuff like that, but there's been a lot of other projects where it's like the sort of noise introduced is like particularly an aesthetic component of like you need to imagine that like noise or like kind of distortion exists in the underlying message that's being passed through, and that helps you sort of understand the artistic message of the creator better. I'm not really interested in aesthetics for aesthetics' sake.
Yeah. Excellent. I mean, yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for packing so much into these 15 minutes.